Greetings. I'm Karen Lawrence, president of the Huntington, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to a special program with the architect Billie Tsien. A warm welcome also, and in particular, to the Southern California architectural community, and particularly to students who come from local universities and colleges in architecture. So we're delighted to have you here. Our program, which you all got, and I'm assuming you read it, lists only some of the accomplishments, awards, and commissions that Billie has received, but it gives you a real sense of her enormous talent and the impact that she's had. Her life and schedule are full with projects and people all over the world. She was going to fly here from a trip to Australia, but luckily her plans changed, so she only needed to have a 6-hour flight from the East Coast to get here, but I'm delighted that she did. She is founding partner of Todd Williams, Billie Tsien Architects Partners. And most recently, you probably have read excellent reviews of the firm's renovation of the David Geffen Hall in Lincoln Center, New York, a project her firm undertook with other teams, each necessary to fixing the acoustics and rethinking the public space of the long-suffering Avery Fisher Hall, AKA David Geffen Hall. A New York Times piece on October 2nd put it this way: Geffen had to become less a fortress, livelier, and more transparent. Tsien and Williams, big-hearted, romantic designers, were given the task of reimagining Geffen's public spaces. I hope Billie likes that expression, but it captures what they did. Their current projects include the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, as well as the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park, Chicago, which will be a topic of our conversation tonight. For those of you here this evening who aren't familiar with the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens, we are one of the oldest cultural and intellectual institutions and centers in Southern California, 103 to be exact, and the proud home to 3 world-renowned collections that provide unparalleled opportunities for cross-disciplinary exploration of culture and for studying the intersection of humans and the environment. In honor of our centennial in 2019, we launched this series, Why It Matters, a series of programs that help us to make some of those connections. We've had programs on libraries, history, liberal arts, museums, and gardens. And we believe our collections, with their humanistic focus, can help shed light on very important contemporary issues facing us now. Billie and I were classmates in college, though we met only recently through what else, an alumni Zoom that took the place of an in-person gathering during COVID. And she's returned to Yale recently as the Charles Guathmy Professor in Practice, a position which she manages to hold at the same time as having an incredibly busy architectural practice too. So I'm delighted that during her visit we've left Zoom behind and that we were able to show her in person today some of the treasures at the Huntington. Billie will start us off by sharing images of some of her firm's projects, and after her slide presentation, the two of us will sit right over there to have a conversation before Q&A with all of you. And I hope everyone received a card. Please do, as you listen, think of questions, and we'll collect them nearing the end of our time so that we have time to look at them. We'll try to answer as many as we can. So now, please join me in welcoming Billie Tsien to the stage.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. I feel like I got a very special tour of the gardens in the rain. And what I was saying, what was amazing was the smells, because the rain brought out all of the smells. It was so beautiful. And then I got an incredible speed tour of the collection and was blown away by the Kendu Wiley. So, and its relationship to the Blue Boy. So I just think very beautiful and exciting things are happening here. And what I thought I would do is talk about, I guess, what matters to me. And I'm going to show 4 projects: an old one, and a new one, an old one, and a new one. And the projects are going to speak about the spirit and about democracy, which I think is kind of apt, seeing as tomorrow is election day. And it's something that we've all been thinking about. So the first old project is a show that we did, which traveled, and Annie Chu and Rick Gooding, who are in the audience, worked on that show with us, where we were asked to design an exhibition of the Akari, which are the lanterns that Noguchi made. And at that time, Noguchi was alive, and we were able to spend some time with him. And looking at the lanterns, he was criticized because people said, you know, you're an artist and you're demeaning your work by making a commercial product. And he said, no, it's a way that people can have my art, and my art can be of use. And so we've always believed that architecture is an art of use. But what I wanted to talk about was this idea of capturing a spirit by not necessarily revealing everything all at once. And so we knew a choreographer named Trisha Brown, and her piece was called If You Could Not See Me. And most of it is danced with her back towards the audience. And it was very much about revealing who she was, but not necessarily showing everything. And this other piece is actually by a young photographer named John Edmonds, and it's a series of people, of young black men who have their backs turned. And so this idea of a kind of slow reveal, because you don't really know what's inside of people until you get to really know them. And so the outside, and certainly I see this as I age, becomes less and less important as what's inside. And so when we worked on this project, we designed a series of fiberglass screens that shielded the lanterns, so you saw their form and their glow, but you didn't see their detail. And in that way, one could sense what the spirit was before one knew what the object was. And it's an idea that continues to sort of influence the work that I do as an architect. So the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia, in many ways, strangely, bears a kind of resemblance to Huntington Gardens, because it was a private house, it was in an arboretum, and it had a very, very personal collection. So Albert Barnes was the primary collector, and he put together a collection which he believed would be for the education of, quote, the common person. So he didn't really want great connoisseurs to come. He wanted people to come and start to look at art in a very different way. And as I said, it was situated in an arboretum because Mrs. Barnes was very, very interested in plants and gardens. So the original building was designed by Paul Cray, who in many ways was the teacher of Louis Kahn. And he designed many classical buildings, but it's a very beautiful, stripped-down neoclassical building. And if you look at the way the paintings are hung, they're hung in a very didactic way, because Barnes believed that one could learn to look at art without knowing history, without knowing who did it, but trying to understand line, color, and form. And so all of the paintings are hung with a center line going through each ensemble. And paintings are similar on either side of the center line. So he was trying to have people use their eyes to look at what was similar. But it resulted in a very intense collection, a very personal collection. And I was talking today with Christina, the curator at the galleries, about these sort of the mise en scène, all the furniture and stuff that goes along with some of the pieces. And he also insisted that there were furniture and objects and hardware that were part of the whole ensemble. So when they moved to Philadelphia, I was talking with Erin about kind of idea, sort of diagrams and where they come from. And this was the first idea kind of diagram. And they often guide us. So it's not architecture, but it's like, what are you trying to get at? What is the spirit? Because very much the spirit of Barnes was the most delicate and the most fragile, and it was really what people were afraid was going to be lost. That sense of the idiosyncrasy of this personal collection. So the diagram said, well, this was a gallery in a garden when it was in Marion, Pennsylvania. So when it moves to downtown Philadelphia, which makes it accessible to many more people, can we still keep that sense of the garden inside the gallery? And certainly, can we make the entrance to the gallery itself feel as if you're walking into a garden? So it needed to have a civic presence. It's on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, which, if you're looking at the image, ends in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And then along that parkway, you also have the Franklin Institute, which is the Science Institute, and the great Free Philadelphia Public Library. So it is a civic thoroughfare. And I think our building, by being made of limestone, but it's a much warmer limestone, is saying we are part of the language that exists. We are not a separate thing. But working with Laurie Olin, and this is a plan of the gardens, one doesn't enter the front door from the Franklin Parkway, although certainly there's a big axial sort of entrance down the Franklin Parkway to the PMA. One first walks into a garden, and you walk through the garden, and you leave behind, we hope, the sense of the city. And as you walk into the garden, there's that very big opening, and you walk into the opening, and you actually don't walk in the front door. You see instead another pool of water with a quote from Dr. Barnes written along the edge. And then you turn into a doorway that's off to the side. So it is very much about this slow reveal. It's not saying, I am here, this is what I am, you know what I am, I'm showing you what I am. It's giving people time to really start to understand it as another person's vision. And not to reproduce it exactly, although you'll see in the images that we had to, by court order, reproduce the gallery spaces. Even as we reproduce them, we change them. But it's about giving the people a sense of peace. And this is a new space that we made, which is a kind of indoor light court. And the light comes in, and the light changes and moves, so you sense the passing of time and the day. And that light court actually extends to an outside space, so it's an outdoor covered space, which they have used extensively during COVID. But this is a sense of a kind of place that is quiet, and then you enter into the gallery experience itself. And on the lower level, there are also public spaces, but places where the garden, and actually we inserted a garden courtyard space that brings light in to the center of the building, goes down to that lower level. So we're trying to make that sense of if it was a gallery in a garden, there is now a garden in the gallery. And then the gallery spaces itself. So we have a changing exhibits gallery. There's a great Modigliani show there right now. But we also needed to give the paintings the home that they deserved. And in order to move this collection, because there were various suits brought against moving it, the judge said you need to keep the ensembles intact, which of course we wanted to do. So we mocked up a gallery and looked at the paintings, and we looked as modernist architects, not to have any trim or cove molding. And what we realized is all of those lines give body and definition to the face. And I said, it's like if you shaved off your eyebrows, your face wouldn't look the same. And so we went in and changed all the details, but essentially kept the same proportions. And everybody thinks that everything is the same, but I would say every surface, every molding, everything is different. But in the end, it's about making a building that both fits, but is also of its own time, fits with the sort of Beaux-Arts tradition of the Franklin Parkway, but also says, this is the new home of the Barnes. So this is this idea about trying to understand and capture the spirit of a person and bring it to a place. And I think that that's a very important thing that we can do with buildings that we make, especially when they are very much about, I think, a kind of the vision of a particular person. So this is another old project, and I'm showing this before I show the Presidential Center, and it was done in La Jolla, California, and it is actually a sort of science institute, and it has now become a part of Scripps. But what I wanted to talk about, because so many of the buildings and their original concept for the building was that it was a single building. And we did two things. Number one, we said the ground plane is of equivalent importance to the building. And so we cut the building into the ground. The second thing we said is that it should be a campus and not one singular building. Because in many ways, a campus is much more about a sense of democracy, because people can walk through even if they're not scientists. And so this is a picture now from the upper level, where actually beneath this hillside are a series of very technical labs. So they're studying a kind of nanotechnology there, which means that it's very good that this has been built into the ground, because vibrations are very problematic when you're studying very, very tiny things. And then the space in the center, and these are earlier images, is seen as a kind of forum or a public place where people are welcome to walk through, to sit by the fountain, and it actually is part of a passageway that takes you to a tunnel that leads you to parking on the other side. So this idea of a campus as being a place that is democratic, that can accept more people than a single building with one guarded entrance, is something that continues to inform our work. And this is Dr. Edelman, who was our client, was a concert-level violinist, and he believed that the auditorium should be made for music and not for scientific lectures. I think both happen there, but his desire was that it be for music. So now I'm going to speak for a little bit longer about the Obama Presidential Center. So this was a competition, and we sent in all of our materials, and it was went from 140 firms all over the world, down to 7, and then they asked all 7 of us to make a presentation. And we were able to meet with President and Mrs. Obama while he was president, and sit in the Oval Office. So it was both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. And I took an apple, because there was that bowl of apples, the sort of iconic bowl of apples, and I brought it home and I gave it to my mother, and I said, this is from the bowl in the Oval Office. So what we did was, and I think it's trying to think about both the spirit of the person and the idea of democracy, was to not start off with the design. And in the end, what we presented, and I saw the other competitors' models and work, was much less a building and more a kind of framework. And so this is what we showed. And these are the words that became a kind of how we thought about the project, very much like a garden in a gallery in a garden, garden in a gallery. The words ennoble and enable. So in many ways, for us, President Obama becoming the president of the country ennobled both the country and, for me, the institution of the presidency. And at the same time, very much, he was always and continues to be about enabling other people. So those two words were very important to us. Now, presidential libraries have traditionally been about storytelling, because you're telling the story of the 4 or 8 years of the presidency. And that is indeed the material of the part that is the museum. But what President Obama wanted to do was make this about story making. Because, and the reason it's called a presidential center rather than a library is 2 reasons. One is his presidency was the first essentially digitally native presidency. So we toured all of the presidential libraries, and there are a lot of archives with papers in bankers' boxes. And they realized, since so much of it was digital already, that it was kind of ridiculous to print out emails on paper and then put them in a box and keep them in the dark. So his entire archives, those which were not digital, are being digitized and will be made public. Certain of the papers that are paper will be kept off-site, but all of the material will be available, and certain archival material will be held in the museum, and also in a presidential reading room, which is part of the branch of the Chicago Public Library, which is also part of what we're doing here. Because what he wants to do is enable people to feel they have the power to make change in the world. So he always talks about standing on the shoulders of others, and what they're doing here is making shoulders for other people to stand on. So storytelling, yes, because it's very important to tell the story. Story making, maybe even more important. And then we showed this diagram, the singular and the plural. And so that goes back again to this idea of, can a campus feel more democratic than a singular building? So we're working with Michael van Valkenburg on this project. And one of the things that we did that you saw in the neurosciences project is that indeed the landscape covers both the library and what is being called the forum. And it comes right up over the top of it. So you could be in Jackson Park walking along, and in fact you couldn't actually walk along the water's edge because there was a 6-lane road running through, which is being removed. Jackson Park becomes a much bigger park. It becomes public, and you could have no intention of necessarily going to the presidential center, but you can find yourself on a path and you can look down onto the public plaza, which is a public plaza, and all of the spaces are free with the exception of the museum, which is ticketed, and feel as if it is part of the park. So above grade, essentially you see 3 different buildings. The one on the far right is going to be a tower. The one in the middle is a public building with a winter garden and a cafe and an auditorium. And then the one on the right has a lot of back of house, but it also has, as I said, that branch of the Chicago Public Library, because he very much wanted it to be a place that the neighborhood could use and not a place simply where tourists and other people came. But this is the below grade plan, so it unites all the buildings. So one floor below, it has the connection that allows you to pass through. And you see those green spaces, just like the garden, the interior courtyard at the barns. Light is brought down to that floor below by actually quite large courtyards that bring green to the center and green to the people and people who are going to be using those spaces. So spaces down below are primarily classrooms with offices. So how do you represent a spirit? And two things, thinking about a light, a light that shines the way, that lights the way, and also this idea of many hands. So this was one of our earlier incarnations, and there's Todd, my partner, and Paul Schulhoff in the blue suit, who's also our partner, sort of presenting it. So President Obama said, if I hadn't become what he became, he said, I would have been an architect. And that's usually, for any architects who are in the office, that's usually where your soul is shriveling. Because for the architects, you know what I mean. But actually, he had some very good ideas. Not always good ideas, but he has some very good ideas. And he, as you can imagine, studied everything and understood the plans. So I also was talking with Karen about how objects are very important to us. And so they're both the sort of diagrams, words, objects. So this is a stone that I bought when I was traveling in Ethiopia. I don't know what it is. I don't know exactly what language it is, but there are letters. I don't even know if it was carved the day before I got there. But there was something that was very powerful, and it looks big, but you can hold it in your hand, and it feels like it was made to be held in your hand. And so this is something, that we have, that it's at home, and I look at it. I've looked at it over many years, and so this idea of kind of making a tower that would glow, it seemed to me that there needed to be something at the top that was about words, because he has always been such an articulate person. And it didn't matter if you could or could not read the words, if you knew that they were words. And at first they didn't like that idea, because it's like, what are the words? There are so many words. Do you use other people's words, my words? But finally they settled on a speech. And it's the speech that President Obama gave at the 50th anniversary of the March on Selma. And like so many of his speeches, it's an incredible speech. But it talks about coming together as a nation. And I think it is about spirit, and I think it is about democracy. So we worked with the graphic designers Pentagram, and they laid out many ways of using these words. And then we needed to think about how to actually make these words. So at first we thought it was all going to be carved out of stone, but it was expensive and heavy and structurally difficult. This is the view from the Sky Room, which is the free space at the very top of the building, where you can look to Lake Michigan and you can also look to the south side. And this is what you would be seeing as you're standing there. And I always thought it would be like kind of being inside the brain of President Obama, because you're looking out through the words that were coming out. But it was not an easy task to try to figure out, once you have this idea of words, how you make it happen. And so a lot of what we do happens in mock-ups. And so this is a very lightweight, very strong concrete. It's not stone, which is being used to form these panels, which are then lifted up and attached to a structure. And then this is a kind of later rendering of what that structure will look like. And then we don't do these, other people do these. I hate fly-throughs. However, it does give you a sense of the site. So it's 19 acres, and as I said, a major road was removed. It's going to become, I think, a much more active public park where everybody is welcome. And it will also have a playground that is part of covering over a parking garage and the making of a topography, because it's been a very, very flat park. We talked about a sledding hill, so there will be a kind of small sledding hill there and a playground. And actually a productive garden, thinking about Mrs. Obama's productive garden at the White House. And then finally, this is taken a while ago, but this is the site. We're under construction, and we are actually above ground now. So that's very, very exciting. I was there last week, and the completion date is 2025. So there's still a way to go. But what I wanted to say was, I think one of the ways that architecture can matter is that it can serve. And if it can serve in a way that transcends the service itself, then there's a possibility that it can be noble. But at its very, very base, the way that we matter is that we serve. So thank you. Are we on? We're on.
Am I as well? Yes? Okay. That was wonderful.
I don't know if I went past my 10 minutes, but...
No one was counting. It was great. And thank you, because you showed both your work and your philosophy of architecture and why architecture matters. So I deeply appreciated your doing that. You know, on your website, you articulate, as you did, your philosophy. And it continues sort of the theme of what you were saying. And I just wanted, there are two lines that struck me. And the first is, we see architecture as an act of profound optimism. Its foundation lies in believing that it is possible to make places on the earth that can give a sense of grace to life, and believing that this matters. It's what we have to give, and it is what we leave behind. And you talked about this, but I'd like you to just say a little more about that sense of grace. I think we feel it in your discussion, but exactly how that works when you think of design and designing a building.
I was talking with Karen earlier today about the jillion things. But I said that when we started working, we did interiors. And so that means that how people use things, how people inhabit things, we always start from the inside and work out. And that's because we are so committed to an idea of making a place that gives people shelter. I mean, and we all look now to shelter as a kind of solace. And so I do believe that the sense of grace comes from people feeling protected. And people feel protected not by the outside of a building, but by the inside of a building.
So you capture the spirit.
Yeah.
That you're talking about.
I mean, we care about our outsides.
Yeah.
We don't want things to leak, all that stuff. But like with people, it's like there's your outside, but who you are is what's inside.
It's striking to me with the President Obama Center, that you moved from the inside out, in that most presidential libraries have the speeches contained inside. And as you said, this is not going to. But instead, the speech is a wrapper for the outside, I mean, which is another way that you turn something inside out.
Oh,
so that
I never thought of that.
So that the words are there. And I guess I have a question, because I know we all think about monuments and what commemorates and the monumental, and a whole series of questioning what we've commemorated and what those monuments are. Can you say a little bit more about, I mean, there's a particular speech that is commemorated, as you were saying, for it. Just if you talk a little bit about the role, I mean, you talked about the role of words and its relation to President Obama, but it strikes me that putting that outside really does bring that interior that you're talking about inside out. Well,
in a way, I have to say it's a kind of mask. So I said we saw other people, we were allowed to sort of go around and look at the other people's proposals. And one of the things during the course of the competition where, people from the foundation said, can you make it more iconic? And it's like, first of all, things become iconic. At least we don't try to make things iconic. And I think if it's truly an icon, it becomes that on its own. It's not because somebody willed an icon into being. And so what I didn't show was a jillion little shapes where we're trying to make something iconic. At the same time, I understood why it is important to make something that feels as if it honors this presidency. And he's actually quite all people of power in the end become, I suppose, people of power, but he's still, he's saying, oh, I don't need an office, I can just sit where everybody else is working. It's like, well, there's Secret Service and a whole other bunch of issues, which makes it really complicated. And then it was like, well, we can maybe just make it all very quiet. And we did, in fact, try to make the other buildings quiet. And so they said, well, make it more iconic. And it's like, people come there and they want to honor him. And if it's all quiet, there's nothing to honor. And it's not a symbol of that. So the reason I said it's a mask is because, well, we made this building, but what makes it iconic is his speech on the outside. And so it kind of relieves us of the responsibility of whatever is iconic. So I'm just saying, we didn't say that to him, and that's the first time I ever said it publicly, but I realized because of your question, it was like, oh, well, those are his words and they're up there, so it's iconic. Don't tell anybody, it's just amongst us.
Just in this small group, right. We'll keep it here. I was also struck by what you said about the barns, and really what it seems, because as I understand from moving it from its original and having to hang it basically the same way, that it's almost like a poetic constraint.
Yeah.
I mean, that you're working within some rules, that you're bound by the trust to do that, and yet it was a spur to your creativity, which I also think sometimes about poetry and rhymes and how that works. But talk a little bit about the balance between honoring history. This is something we think a lot about at the Huntington. How do you, I mean, I have thought of it as respect the past, don't be afraid to re-examine the past or examine the past and reimagine the future. And it seemed when you showed the barns that there was a way that you did that. And there were all sorts of odds against you, as I, just having read about moving it and whether people would accept that it's different, but keeps some of its spirit and history.
For anybody who's an architect in the audience, I see Fred Fisher's there, as well as Annie and Rick, Bill Fain. So what we do is always about constraints. And I studied art as an undergraduate when we were together, not knowing each other.
Not knowing each other.
And the problem for me with being an artist was that there are no constraints. So you had to make up your own problem, then you had to solve your problem, and then you had to decide if you did a good job solving your problem. Whereas architecture gives you these handcuffs, or it gives you a box that you have to sort of either work within, kick your way out of, or stomp on. But at least it gives you those constraints. And so I think that is what architecture does. We work with constraints. And I think over time, for many good reasons, I think the constraints will become bigger. I mean, we're trying to understand how to be more sustainable. We're trying to understand how to reuse and rethink existing buildings so that we're not always building new. And we're trying to understand the sense of landscape. And so I think that those constraints it's a kind of different set of constraints, but I think constraints it's like our food. So it can either give you food poisoning, or it can help you sort of grow in ways that you wouldn't have without them.
So one of the questions I was intending to ask is about sustainability. I mentioned to you we've finished a strategic plan, and not surprisingly, that is a major priority. How much is that a duty, a constraint, an inspiration to leave the earth better than you found it? How does that enter into your practices as an architect?
I both embrace it, and I have also some feelings which are sort of arguing for a different kind of idea of sustainability. So I would say we work from the very beginning with amazing engineers, and so the Barnes was the first LEED Platinum, for whatever that means, newly built museum at the time. But the requirements are always changing, so I don't know where it would be now. And the Presidential Center will be a net zero. And we're not generating the energy on the property. We're doing a number of things that are very important, but a lot of it will be offset, but it will be net zero. And that's a big struggle because it's a very big project. But I also disagree with the idea that all buildings should be all somehow very light on the land and necessarily disappear. I think of the building that all architects use as their sort of hallmark, kind of the Pantheon. So it's thousands of years. It's had many uses. It's had many lives. And it continues to be a place of importance. So I think, when we build, like every decision on the Presidential Center is like, is this a 500-year building? Because that's what we want it to be at the very least. And everything that we do, it's like, is this 100 years? Because I think buildings need to be made with a sense of integrity so that they can be reused and not sit lightly on the land and not be simply washed away. I think when you have the responsibility to make a mark, it needs to be a solid mark and a mark that will stand the test of time. Now, clearly not all buildings stand the test of time, but I think that needs to be an intention. So that's where I kind of disagree with this idea of, it should be bamboo, it should be torn down in 20 years, it shouldn't, I don't believe.
Let me ask that you, with your questions, that I'll ask another question, but I'd love to take the ones from you. So we're going to pass them, if you write them. Have they already been collected or no? So if you would, let's see, Alice, where are you? And there you are, yeah. So just because I want to leave enough time for you, and we'll talk a little bit more, but then we'll have folks collect some questions, and we'll do those so you have a chance to ask. I'm going to shift gears and say that living with and working with the same partner, as you do, you and Todd, presents both opportunities and challenges, I would imagine. And I say that with my own spouse in the audience. So how do you, when you work together, who plays what roles, and how do you create a vision and execution? Are there ways that you can kind of clarify that, or is it very much working together on, on the whole thing?
So I was talking with Bill Fain, who's an architect and planner, and his daughter is a landscape architect. And you were saying your son is involved in literature?
Yeah.
But not the same.
Not the same.
It's not the same area.
I'm in Irish and English, he's in Latin American and American.
But so you share something, but you also don't share something.
Yeah.
And I think the way that we have worked together is that there is the sharing and the not sharing. So I would say we are both trying to get to the same end, but we use a different path. And I know that Todd is very interested in how things are built, how things are put together, and the kind of detail that only other architects can see, which I'm always saying, nobody else can see that except like 5% of the architects that might be there. So, but that, and I'm not saying it's only, he's just interested in the technical stuff, but that is his joy. And I think I'm very interested in a kind of, because my background was in art, in texture and color, in the sensate aspect of it, and the emotional aspect of it. So I feel like those come together, and sometimes we switch, but not that often, but they come together because they're not the same thing. And so Bill, can talk with his daughter about design because it's not the same, they're not exactly the same thing, just as you talk with your son about literature. So that's how we've done it in the past.
Okay, so some questions from the audience. We'll take a few. How can architecture increase public inclusion at cultural institutions like the Huntington? Yeah.
Every single cultural institution that we're working with is concerned about this. And each answer for each cultural institution is different. But what is heartening is that everybody is concerned about this. And so, at Geffen, there is both on the ground floor a sense of, and some people have complained it's not formal enough, but it's a sense of of a kind of welcome. So just in terms of the way the furniture is placed, the fact that there's a sort of carpet, it's dumb stuff, but it's like Wi-Fi. There's great Wi-Fi. One of the best coffee purveyors is there. And so people will come in not intending in any way to go to see a concert. And what they've also done is, I'm not a huge fan of digital screens. There is a 45-foot long digital screen. And what they will do is live stream the concerts. So let's say you're not interested in classical music, or let's say you don't have a babysitter, or let's say you came by to get a cup of coffee. You can sit in and watch it for free. And so this is all about making the music accessible. So as I said, you're asking that question. Each time it's a different answer. And then on the floor above, for those of you who haven't been to Avery Fisher, it was beige, everything. Life was beige. And so we brought in a huge amount of color. And one of the things I didn't show was this, as we talk about the Pantheon, there's the most amazing experience, which is at Pentecost. Because if you're at the Pantheon and you stand up during what is like 15-hour ceremony, I don't know what, at the end, they drop in rose petals from that opening. And these rose petals, representing the tongues of flame of knowledge, first come down as a few petals, and then it's like a waterfall. And when I was there, I burst into tears because it is so beautiful. So we've made these very big murals that are huge rose petals that are sort of falling from tier to tier. So it's a combination. You can't welcome people in the same way. So it's always going to be a layered effect. And, as I said, each institution is both concerned with it, and the answer has to be very particular to the place.
Yeah. But it seems to me that your work is very, and we were talking before about place-based and specific, that things translate, but they're also very rooted.
Yeah. I think that's what the best architecture does. It feels like, wow, this couldn't be any other place but here. It shouldn't feel like, wow, this could be in Abu Dhabi or Doha or wherever.
So here's a question. Could you talk about your childhood and how you came to practice architecture?
Well, one of the reasons why I never met you when I was in college is because I'm incredibly shy. And so I went into my dorm room. I think I only came out for meals as far as I could remember, and classes.
I also came out for meals, but I understand what...
But what I did was, as many shy people do, is I lived in stories, and I read all the time. And so this idea of other people's stories and making a story first led me to art, and then when I realized I needed the constraints, led me to architecture. So I think it's very much, for me, it was very much about having an internal life. We were the only Chinese family in this suburban town in New Jersey, and so I needed to sort of make my own little treehouse, which was a sort of treehouse of books. And, over time, I've learned to speak. I feel comfortable now speaking in front of people, because I think, but actually what I learned, and I think I also knew, and that I think is very much, I told Karen I'm culturally totally American. All of my references are American. I was an American teenager, I was just music, everything, and I actually never even learned to speak Chinese. Psychologically, I'm completely Chinese. So, when I get angry, I become silent, and the angrier I am, the less I say. And, so there's a kind of dynamic happening there. And I think in many ways, the internal life, this idea that you have a slow reveal, that you don't show everything to everybody right away, and the fact that I believe that there's a strength in being quiet, although I haven't been quiet at all tonight. I think that has very much to do with my life growing up and being Chinese.
I do want to say, for those of you who were here for the last Why It Matters with Lonnie Bunch, that I have not pre-selected everyone to come from New Jersey like me. I didn't know that about Billie, but we discovered that as well. And a question: what role do you think, I gotta put my glasses on for this, of biomimicry having in architecture and design?
I think architecture needs to be very aware of nature and place. I don't think architecture is building. Building is made out of hard things. When buildings are finished, I was saying I could never be a landscape architect because I could never accept the fact that it keeps on doing it without you. So I understand the desire to have softer forms and perhaps the ability to make forms that feel more comfortable with nature. But I think at the base, it's like two different species. So coexistence and understanding that one is not more important than the other, I think, is how things come together.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask you one more question, which I think is a good way to end, and thank you again, Billie. Is there a project that you've dreamed about doing that has yet to come your way? I saved an easy one for the last.
People have asked that, and the common answer is, well, which is your favorite child? You can't really say which is your favorite child. And I guess I'm going to take a kind of easy way out. Certainly the Presidential Center is something that is deeply, deeply important to me. But in its own way, architecture is not something where you go out and choose the work. People and the work chooses you. And so you always are hoping for that great dance partner to come and choose you. And so I think each project has the potential to be a wonderful project. I was just going to end on this so we were working on this very small project, which is an entrance pavilion to Brooklyn Bridge Park, which was built at a time when people didn't realize how important parks were. Now we all realize how important parks were when we live in a city. And so there's so many people coming in, and it was never planned for. And so it's simply a pavilion with public bathrooms and some sort of concession stand. And I love this project not because of its size, but because it is about welcoming people, every single person. So in a way, when you work with a client with whom you share a vision, and that's what we've tried to do during the entire time I've been working, is to work with clients where you share the vision, then each one is very dear,
It's beautiful. Thank you, Billie. you.